So whilst we're waiting, I think there's going to be a little bit of rearranging of chairs. I've got a wonderful panel coming up. So we've had the chance to meet. They've got some great perspectives. And what I've asked each of them to really focus on is, what do you believe is the current barrier, the biggest barrier to the ESG funds really getting into emerging markets? And what do you think is probably the one enabler that you think could make the biggest difference there? I haven't led the witness at all, so I really look forward to the perspectives of the panel. Are we set with the chairs? Somebody might need to remind me on the seating plan, please. I'll let you. Okay, please, come up, panel. And if we can give them a warm round of applause, and then we'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, welcome on the stage, everybody. And it's been wonderful getting to know you all and getting to know your perspectives over the last week or so. We've got ready for this panel. In terms of what we want to cover, really what we want to cover is, we've all heard today about the investment gap in terms of ESG funds and the flow of those funds into emerging markets, and that something needs to be done about it. So what I'd love for you to do, if you're okay with this, I'm going to start with Iyad. It'd be great if you could just introduce yourself and your role. And if you could just, in a minute and a half, because we're going to have to be really sharp on timing, just what do you think is the biggest thing that could be done in terms of enabling ESG funds to get there? And what's that barrier that you're seeking to address? Or you can do it in the other order. Let me start with you, Iyad.
So I think it's been said throughout the sessions today. I think the biggest barrier is in the own definition of ESG.
Yes.
So ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance, given priority to the environment, which is definitely important for the humanity and so on, but it's given secondary importance to social and governance.
Yeah.
Even agencies are given more weight to environment, some of them 60 to 70%. So this, from the outset, it undermines the developing, countries.
So less of a balance across ESG, a key barrier.
From a starting point, and it does not really measure the impact. And there are lots of investors, and I think today's tool that you've introduced, it will play a role in really bringing up the visibility of the importance of the social and governance into play. There is one tool that is very critical and important that could be integrated. It needs to be uplifted as well, which is the impact multiple of money.
Yes.
So investing $1 in a developing country or emerging market, it would have more multiples than investing the same investment. A solar panel investing in a developing country would have more multiple impact than the same solar panel in a developed country. And this is not yet visible, because we're talking about ESG, so this needs to be visible to the investment.
And you're talking multiple from a financial returns and a socioeconomic returns perspective?
Exactly, from an ESG perspective.
Fantastic. And Iyad, you didn't introduce yourself. Do you mind?
So I am...
Just quickly.
I'm Iyad El-Garqawi. I'm the General Secretary of the Board of SABIC and Investor Relations Officer. So I've been really very close to the investors in the past 4 or 5 years, and I've seen how ESG has trended up from not being brought, from investors to being really the center point of attention by investors across the globe.
Fantastic, thank you. Marika, if I could ask you the same 2 questions, but also if you could introduce yourself, that'd be wonderful.
Yes, so my name is Marika, so I'm an associate prof at HEC in Paris. And so what I do, well, I teach and I think about and I try to act on topics related to inequality, business and sustainability. And I've also been involved in the drafting of the new standards at EU level, specifically on equal opportunities. Now, maybe just to build on actually what you said just earlier, I think what was said was one of the barriers is the separation of ESG, and I think it has served us good because it's easy, but in fact there's so many interlinkages between the E and the S and the G, and actually if we were able to make that more visible, there would be much more value to be seen and also to be captured. So and now in that same spirit about silos, so silos between these topics, but also silos between different forms of finance. So maybe that's the one that I would kind of put forward and draw your attention to or discuss with you guys, to what extent should we be thinking about forms of finance like the Gavi, an instrument which is really about connecting public-private funding towards a common societal issue, in this case, vaccines and immunization. Maybe this is also a powerful tool that could be leveraged in emerging markets to draw attention to a very high priority issue and to create leverage between different forms of finance. So that would be maybe something that I'd like to emphasize. And then another very small thing, maybe we need a bit of affirmative action in these funds. Maybe we need to foresee a certain percentage of funds that are dedicated to investments in emerging markets. Just like we do this in procurement, EU procurement, we have some social clauses, we dedicate certain, and this could be a very powerful means to actually lift up investment in emerging markets.
Great idea, thank you. Rick, thanks for joining.
Yeah, Rick Lakai. I lead our ESG efforts at State Street at the bank-wide level. I spent most of my career, may know a number of you, as an asset manager. So I've spent 12 years as the Global Chief Investment Officer at SSGA. So you've asked great questions. Some of them are just commercial questions. Do asset managers see a large enough market that they're going to have the opportunity cost of not launching a developed market ESG fund? They're going to launch an EM one. So straightforward commercial questions. And then you've got the investment factory. Is it interesting, ESG and EM? I think it's really interesting. You know, the cross-sectoral distribution of returns in EM for alpha generation is enormous. And there are many companies that are, in a sense, poor and could be better. However, there are a couple of things about emerging economies that are important. One is they're a very energy-intensive stage of their growth very often. They have old energy systems. And so the best thing you can do maybe as an investor is buy those companies that are in that energy business and be with them in improving in transition finance. The optics of that sometimes look ugly because immediately you'll have a terrible looking carbon footprint in your portfolio. But in terms of positive impact and contribution, it could be extremely large relative to, say, a clean tech investment that you might have with a developed market fund.
Thank you, Rick. Habib. Thank you for joining us on the panel.
Thank you, Doug.
Please, same two questions, and if you could introduce yourself, that'd be wonderful.
Wonderful. Habib Abdurrahman, Head of ESG at Investcorp. And really, in my role, I have responsibility for developing, designing and executing our sustainable investing strategy across our corporate activities as well as our investing platforms globally. And to directly address your questions around barriers, you know, I think one of the key things that could be seen as a barrier is the perception that there are a lack of credible investment opportunities in the emerging markets. And I think that's just not true. I think there are opportunities in the emerging markets, and perhaps they just don't fit the sweet spot of the traditional investors' investment criteria. And I think what's really driving this is the perception of higher risk in the emerging markets, which is really being driven, at least in my view, by a lack of understanding or perhaps in-depth understanding of the market, competitive, regulatory, cultural, importantly, dynamics that are present in these markets. And let's not forget, Doug, that the emerging markets, of course, are not one homogeneous entity. And so it becomes even more interesting when you look at the differing sorts of dynamics from a competitive perspective, from a market perspective, from a regulatory perspective. And I can't emphasize enough a cultural perspective that needs to be understood. And so I think what you've done here today and what the FII has put together is incredible. And I think it's important for us to really look at what is relevant and material in these emerging markets, and then really work to implement that and adopt those standards and principles in our investing activities. And so I congratulate you on the contribution you've made in the field.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. On that note, Anna, thanks for joining the panel. Please, if you don't mind introducing yourself and addressing those two questions, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Of course.
Great group to be following, and a real pleasure to be with you. Anna Moore, I'm a partner with McKinsey here in London, where I co-lead our sustainability strategy practice across Europe, and I lead our basic materials practice and built environment here in the UK and Ireland. So I spend all of my time a bit at this intersection of hard-to-abate sectors, helping clients think through what are the sustainable investments we need to be making, and how can we really play offense with sustainability versus seeing this as a risk mitigation matter, and really create green growth. And for us, how did we get to where we are? Really a failure of collective action.
Yeah.
And we see a source of optimism in green growth. We estimate $9 to $12 trillion in new green value pools by the mid-2030s. And that's going to come from greater circularity, including in emerging markets. It'll come from green materials. It'll come from decarbonizing the energy sector. And those are really global opportunities that require global action and private sector leadership. And so for us, the solution needs to come now from business seeing this really as an opportunity to create new green growth. And that gives us a cause for optimism. Great to be with you.
Oh, it's brilliant to have you all. Thank you very much. So what I'd love to do is just for the rest of our session, I just want to thank you. You guys have been absolutely bang on. If anything, you've been about 30 seconds each shorter, which is amazing. Thank you, which means that we've got more time for discussion. So maybe we could start with the question on barriers and just dig into that a little bit more. Iyad, you highlighted the big barrier is that actually we're giving different weighting across E, S, and G. And in particular, a lot of the choices that are being made are focused very much on the E. How do you, maybe you could just expand on that a little bit, but it would be really good just to get your views on how do we start to redress that balance? How do we start to bring much more of the social development considerations into the choices that are made in relation to environment?
Yeah, so maybe let me build on a real example. The company I work for, SABIC, and I think Bob, our technology officer, was here in one of the sessions.
Yes.
So we are addressing the environmental aspects. We're doing all what it takes in terms of technology, transitioning, reducing emissions, and so on. But I don't see investors that are recognizing this because, at least from an ESG perspective, because they look at SABIC from an emerging market lens. They don't look at SABIC from a developed market lens. And the reason why, because the different ESG rating agencies, basically they look at the ESG similar to the way they look at the credit rating. So basically they look at it as a risk. And by mere definition, emerging markets are higher risk than developed markets. So to address your question, I would say that risk mitigation should be addressed separately from ESG. ESG should be clearly how the impact on the environment, how the impact on the social, and how the impact on the governance. We have lots of initiatives that we do, but again, because of the same point on risk, they are not being recognized. A couple of examples is the employment, not the direct employment that we do, but also the indirect employment and supporting jobs and so on. There is a program called Nusanid, which is in Arabic, it's to support and help, which again is creating multiple dimensions in building on the products that we produce and so on, in employing boys and girls in Saudi, supporting them financially and so on, which again improves the standard of living, improves the quality of jobs and so on. The second example is again because 80% of our assets are based in Saudi, so water is scarce. So we focus on minimizing the use as much as possible in our processes. And you see SABIC is really above the average in terms of water usage. Is it recognized by investors and ESG agencies? No, again, because of the same reason that I've highlighted.
I think what you've described is an ESG strategy that is really targeted at things that are most important to your stakeholders in relation to the context where you work. Marika, it'd be really interesting in terms of barriers to understanding that context and the implications of that. I don't know whether you could talk to that, please.
You mean the context?
Well, in terms of in terms of the local context, i.e. an ESG strategy that's targeting employment-related issues, water scarcity issues, how are some of the ways in which those barriers to understanding that could be addressed? I think you mentioned, looking at particular issue-related funds that could potentially address particular topics.
Yeah. So let me think. So
I'm sorry if I made it difficult.
No, no. I think I mean, if I draw from my own experiences here in Europe, where we've spent about a year now trying to build standards that will be obligatory, mandatory for all companies to report on.
Yeah.
And so there's that true tension about relevance. Does it make sense for companies to require them to report on so many different dimensions?
Yes.
So that's been lots of work to kind of actually come up with a set of standards that we think are actually sector agnostic, that are relevant to our understanding. And I think that kind of work would be interesting actually to see to what extent that can be helpful to actually shed light on certain issues.
Yes.
I think it can go two ways, either very bottom up,
yeah.
so companies who actually look at what is going on around me and how can what is the lever I can actually pull to make a positive impact, or it can go really top down. So the EU example is one where EU actually shapes the lenses you use to see things, and then they will make visible certain topics that were not top of mind, but maybe very important for you to make progress on and to track and monitor.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to get your views on any good practices that you've seen out there in the world in terms of investors really starting to engage in relation to ESG and emerging markets, and where you see that make a difference. It'd be great if we could point to some examples. Maybe, Rick, I could just sort of bring you in first in terms of a response to that.
Well, the first thing to note is that some things look like they're more national than global in terms of what you're expecting in the standards. And maybe in some ways, E is the easiest one. We all face the decarbonisation challenge, but as I mentioned, emerging economies are more energy intensive.
Yes.
And you can't just switch the lights off in South Africa because they're burning coal. But I think S is probably the most contentious. S is the least global because it reflects national preferences and a lot of other issues, quite honestly. And so addressing the whole dimension of social, not just decent work, but many other issues, is extraordinarily hard. Yeah. For me, the starting point should always be G. When I think about the long history of investing money and where people have really lost a lot of money, it's always when G has gone wrong, and often that's been the root cause of an E that's gone wrong.
Right.
National standards are different there as well, and we accommodate that, but we do have an absolute standard that we're aspiring to. And I think that helps, in a way, raise the other elements as well. So I think my case study is focus on the national element where it really has to be, but focus on the longer-term goal, particularly with corporate governance.
Okay, thank you.
And Doug, if I could
Habib,
add
please
to that,
do.
I think it's important to also appreciate some of the key developments we've been seeing in the emerging markets when it comes to implementing ESG and sustainability strategies. And some of the things that I've seen, which I think are really positive developments, are, in the first instance, really broad-based, government-led sustainability strategies, looking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years into the future. That's really important because it sets the vision, the direction, the roadmap for companies, individuals operating in these markets. And what that's also done, and we're seeing increasing amounts of this happening, is really the sovereign wealth funds, the banks, the large asset owners really implementing sustainability thinking into everything they do. That wasn't there before. It's now happening in greater amounts today. It's also meant that asset managers are incorporating ESG considerations into their thinking. And what I've experienced, I operate in the emerging markets, I've been in the emerging market for the past decade, and what that essentially what I've seen happening is that sort of thinking is also becoming more sophisticated as investors are beginning to appreciate in greater detail the value that can be derived from incorporating such considerations into what they do. And I think just to build on Rick's point around governance, extremely important. And what I see from my day-to-day interactions with companies in the emerging markets, and also, operating in the country. I'm based in the United Arab Emirates, but corporate governance standards have come a long way across many parts of the emerging markets. That is going to drive better disclosure standards, and better disclosures really to enforce the disclosure requirements that are also coming. So these are all, I think, really important things that we should acknowledge and we should build upon. And I think when you're looking at frameworks like the framework that we're seeing with the FII putting in force, we should really look at what it could actually offer to the emerging markets and really adopt it and give it a go.
That's what we'd like. Yes, please.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Anna, it'd be great to get your perspectives on some good practices that you see, where you see investors really doing a good job at considering and focusing their investments on the things that matter most in emerging markets.
Sure. I think when people think ESG in emerging markets, they think cost and risk.
Right.
They think about the billion people who will live in extreme heat stress. They think about the challenges faced by Nike in the 90s, and they think, okay, this is all a bit too complicated and expensive. And I think Habib's point around value is really critical, right? For us, the best practice is to look for where the opportunities really are. And in emerging markets, for example, we see considerable opportunity around circularity. So let's take plastics as one example. We see today about a $2,000 per ton premium for recycled PET versus virgin product. That's driven by CPG companies making commitments around more circular product. A lot of the feedstock to produce recycled plastic exists in emerging economies. And so there's an enormous opportunity to create sustainable, high-paying jobs in emerging markets and contribute to our collective net zero goals. And I think a lot of investors sometimes miss that. And really, for us, this point around creating value and seeing an alignment between value and values, if you will, is critical.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. At the end of the day, this isn't just an investor's problem. They're not looking at EM issues in the way in which they look at ESG. It's also what changes can be made at a company level, at a government level. Habib, you highlighted how government policy can be transformational in terms of the way in which an investor looks at a country. And what can happen at a sort of activist level to really make certain companies more attractive from an ESG perspective in emerging markets. Marika, I'm going to ask you that question first, and then Iyad, I'm going to ask you also to comment on that question, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. I think when we're talking about standards, we're talking about information, and we're creating a lot of information.
Yep.
Maybe not enough, and maybe it's contentious still. Certain dimensions, we're not really sure. Are we really capturing the social in important ways, or are we missing the point? But there's a lot of information out there, and the question is, who will be able to use it over and beyond investors? So, because that's the sort of push we also need, because it's about accountability, who will hold companies accountable. And so we will, in my view, we need to make sure there's a civil society in these economies that can actually use that information to hold companies accountable. Activists, they are, as we have recently seen with ExxonMobil, they can come on the board and say, well, we don't agree with the strategy of ExxonMobil, not sufficiently green. So there is power to those voices, and I think they're incredibly important to actually even justify the enormous costs of this data collection. I'm also calling upon professors who are not really in the audience, but so we need to make the most of this data, and so that's the role I see activists, civil society play to make that data credible and legitimate.
Thank you. Sorry, did you want to add something on that point?
I think it's interesting with activists because you have indeed examples like Exxon, but you also have Unilever, Danone, others who have had the reverse, right? Where there's been pressure to maintain a focus purely on profit and not on sustainability goals as well. And so I think for investors, it's really a challenge to maintain a long-term view, and to really maintain the focus. And I'd be curious for views from the group on this, on what will create value long-term, right, which is alignment with net zero. But it's very much a transition that's going to be spiky and non-linear, and I think we see activists pushing in both directions, actually.
Well, Iyad, in terms of at a company level, what can actually enable you to be more attractive as an investment choice for an investor?
Maybe I'll steal 20 seconds just to build on.
You really teased me and said, yeah.
On a point that Marique has said, affirmative action.
Yes.
I think really to make progress in really putting funds into emerging markets, there has to be affirmative action.
Yes.
The United Nations, they have the principle of responsible investment. And I was looking at it, more than $60 trillion of investors, collectively assets under management, 1,500 investors, but they are very, very much so underrepresented from emerging markets.
Yeah.
Only 1 in 11 board members are from emerging markets. So they are underrepresented. So I think there has to be, from a United Nations, from a global organization like the United Nations, to really enforce the SDGs, because we've heard SDGs. Out of the 17 SDGs, only 4 are environment.
Yeah.
Ending hunger and poverty and so on are not really getting enough attention. To your point, in SABIC, basically we've been working into transparency and reporting for more than a decade. We've been issuing our sustainability report. And it has improved with time in terms of the level of progress that we make and the level of disclosures. And we've even taken it one step further by creating an executive committee that basically takes in charge the SDG reporting to be at the same standard that we do our financial reporting, co-headed by our CTO and CFO. And I think one of the most important things that a lot of global organizations do from a governance point of view, this has been taken in charge by the board. So we have a dedicated board committee, risk and sustainability, that's really taken in charge the ESG disclosures. And not only that, but also how the action plans that we've put in place are being executed. And we've been reporting on whatever commitments that we've made back in 2000, for example, 2018, in an annual basis, whether from the environment, whether from even some of the social aspects that we've put in place.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We've got 3 minutes left, and I'm just really keen that we start to be very, very optimistic. So there is clearly a problem that needs to be cracked, which is making sure that those companies that are doing the best job in relation to ESG in emerging markets get the investment flows that they deserve and the benefits that comes from that. So we know that's a problem that needs to be solved. We've talked about some of the enablers of that, and it's not just at the investor level, it's also at the company level, it's at the country level, it's at the other stakeholder level as well. But if we were to crack this, what would be the benefits that we should expect to see? What would be the benefits of it that might help to supplement the investment thesis of an investor, really shifting their strategy around this? I'm going to start with you, Rick, if I may, on that.
If I may, I think you make great returns if you own a business that changes in a positive way. ESG is a very important dimension of that. We need to broaden the lens in terms of our definitions of ESG to encompass things like transition finance, so that we're allowing ourselves to buy, let's just say, poor businesses or businesses that are unprepared for the transition, and support them and push them through that transition. I don't just mean the transition to a low-carbon economy, but in other directions as well. And that involves allowing ourselves to be somewhat more flexible in the way that we're thinking about what we're prepared to own right now, because it's the rate of change that really matters. And then I think you'll get both a return premium and you'll also have an impact.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think the biggest benefit of more ESG funds coming into the emerging markets is really the opportunity here to make a big impact on the sustainable development objectives of the emerging markets. Because let's not forget, some of the largest, most diverse and important ecosystems in the world are in the emerging markets.
Yes.
And so if you really want to make a change and make an impact in a big way in the emerging markets or globally, you need to be looking at the emerging markets. And so that's a really important consideration, I think. And I think to Rick's point around returns, absolutely. I think there are significant opportunities, and they will come over time. You need to make a deliberate choice of what you want to own today, with an acknowledgement of what that journey looks like. But there are attractive risk-return opportunities that exist in the emerging markets.
Brilliant, thank you. 45 seconds, so 10 seconds, please, Anna. What's the big benefit?
Economic growth. This will be the largest driver of growth in our lifetimes.
Brilliant. Marika, biggest benefit?
Survival, but also giving hope to all the young people in emerging markets who will be, in some countries, the biggest group in those societies. So we need to invest in entrepreneurship. We need to invest in young people who can actually change their local environments. So it's about reaching those sustainable development goals.
Fantastic. Thank you. Last 5 seconds.
Yeah, I think it's very well said. I think we're talking about ESG, so fairness, and to make sure that I quote one number here, $95 trillion, until 2060, it has to fund emerging markets in order really to address the existential threat of the environment.
Perfect. Thank you. Panel, you've been absolutely amazing. We've kept to time, so thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Please, if we could give everybody a round of applause, that'd be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stay on stage. Thank you very much.